The spring of 1945 found Bavaria transformed into a landscape of collapse and liberation. In the chaos of those final weeks, the German leadership abandoned everything they could not carry, leaving behind the darkest chapters of their regime. Hidden among the rubble was a military brothel where German women had been held captive for years. Their freedom stolen, their futures erased. When American armor came thundering through the smoke and dust, a young woman named Greta Weber, only 23 years old, positioned herself instinctively in front of the younger girls around her. This protective stance had become second nature to her since she was 19. The women surrounding her had learned a bitter truth through their confinement. Liberation by enemy soldiers meant trading one nightmare for another. Freedom under new masters would look exactly like slavery under old ones. But as the dust settled and American soldiers began moving through the buildings, something unexpected began to unfold. Instead of violence and division, the soldiers distributed blankets, clean blankets that carried the scent of soap and care, nothing like the stench of sweat and desperation that had defined the women's imprisonment. When Sergeant Morrison posted regulations in German on the barracks wall, stating clearly that no prisoner would face sexual assault or harm, the women believed it was cruel mockery. Yet day after day, nothing changed. No hands reached out uninvited. No one entered their quarters without permission. These weren't the monsters they had been warned to fear. Somehow, impossibly, these were men who still recognized their humanity and were determined to protect it. But how do you rebuild trust when trust itself feels like the deepest kind of betrayal? The rumble came first, a deep vibration rising from the earth itself, growing louder until the floorboards beneath them trembled. Greta Weber pressed her back against the wooden wall of the barracks and moved sideways instinctively, placing herself between the approaching sound and the two younger women huddled on their narrow cots behind her. At 23, she had learned that protection meant becoming the first target, the most visible barrier. American tanks, someone whispered barely audible above the mechanical roar, drawing ever closer. Her hands twisted the thin fabric of her dress repeatedly, a nervous habit that had worn permanent creases into the cotton over 3 years of captivity. Ingrid Schneider sat rigidly on her cot, her 28-year-old body maintaining the perfect posture of the schoolteacher she had once been. "They're coming through the main road," she said with clinical precision, though her knuckles had turned white, gripping the edge of her blanket. The Nazi leadership had fled before daybreak, vanishing and leaving everything behind. Everything including these women. The barracks fell silent except for their shallow breathing and the growing thunder outside. Through the single grimy window, Greta could see dust clouds rising in the distance, illuminated by pale April sunlight. She had occupied this room for 4 years since soldiers had arrived at her village and informed her family she was needed for essential work. The deception had been so professional, so official sounding. Her mother had even packed a small bag containing her best dress and her grandmother's prayer book. The prayer book had long since disappeared, exchanged for an extra piece of bread during the brutal winter of 1943. Greta still carried every word of those prayers in her memory, words her grandmother had taught her syllable by syllable, though speaking them had become impossible. The mechanical rumbling grew deafening, then abruptly ceased. In the silence that followed, Greta heard male voices calling out in English, sharp and authoritative commands she couldn't understand but recognized instantly as the language of conquest. She had heard German officers issue similar orders when claiming new posts. That unmistakable tone of men seizing control over territory. "Stay behind me," she whispered, knowing even as she spoke how futile the gesture was. There was nowhere to run, nowhere they could hide. The barracks had no back entrance, no escape routes. They had long ago stopped searching for such things. Heavy boots crunched across gravel outside, drawing closer with each step. Multiple sets of them moving with military discipline. Greta felt her body instinctively assume the stance that had kept her alive for 4 years. Shoulders back, eyes downcast, hands loosely clasped at her sides. Available but not eager, compliant but not broken. It was a delicate balance requiring months to perfect. Liesel made a small whimpering sound and pressed herself flat against the far wall. She had been only 16 when they transported her from the Hamburg orphanage, told she was going to factory work. The youngest among them, she had never truly mastered the art of concealing her fear the way the others had. Her terror remained too honest, too transparent. "Breathe," Ingrid murmured, her teaching instinct still alive despite everything surrounding them. "Just breathe." The boots stopped directly outside their door. A man's voice spoke in English, then another answered. Greta caught the word secure and understood enough to recognize they were discussing the building, its contents, what inventory they had found. She had become fluent in the language of being counted and catalogued. The door handle turned slowly, squeaking against rusted metal. Greta straightened her spine and lifted her chin slightly, not with defiance but with presence, making herself visible. She had discovered it was better to be seen immediately than to be discovered hiding. Men who found you concealed always assumed you had something worth punishing. Sunlight flooded into the dim barracks as the door swung wide, silhouetting a tall figure wearing an American uniform. Behind him stood more soldiers, younger men with clean-shaven faces and pressed khaki that smelled of soap and starch rather than sweat and tobacco. The officer in the doorway paused, observing the scene before him. His eyes moved from Greta to Liesel to Ingrid, and she witnessed something cross his features that she hadn't seen in a man's face for 4 years. Something that resembled shock, then recognition, then something she struggled to identify. Something that might have been compassion if she dared permit herself such hope. He spoke quietly to the soldiers behind him, then stepped back without crossing into their space. "We're not going to hurt you," he said in careful, accented German. "You're safe now." The words hung suspended like smoke, simultaneously impossible to believe and impossible to dismiss. Something shifted within Greta's chest, a hairline fracture in the protective walls she had constructed around her expectations. She had learned not to trust promises from men wearing uniforms, but this man hadn't even entered their space. The truck bed was lined with clean canvas that smelled nothing like diesel or unwashed bodies. Greta sat pressed between Liesel and Ingrid, their shoulders touching, a formation they had maintained throughout countless transports across the years. Yet this time, no one separated them. No one pointed at Liesel and forced her into a different vehicle or shoved Ingrid toward an officer's transport. They remained together. That small mercy felt so extraordinary that Greta almost couldn't comprehend it. The American soldier driving the truck helped them climb aboard without unnecessary touching. He simply extended his hand palm upward, waiting for them to choose whether they wanted his assistance. When Liesel flinched away from the offered help, he quietly positioned a wooden crate beside the tailgate so she could climb up on her own. Through the canvas opening, Greta watched the Bavarian countryside roll past, fields scarred by tank treads and scattered equipment, yet still verdant with spring growth. The war was ending. Everyone spoke of it. She had heard it whispered among the guards during their final days, seen it in how the Nazi officers had destroyed documents and vanished before dawn. But endings had never meant freedom for women like them. Endings simply meant new beginnings under different masters. Camp Lucky Strike stretched across a hillside resembling a temporary city. Rows of canvas tents and wooden structures arranged in neat military formation, enclosed by wire fences that felt disturbingly familiar. Greta's stomach tightened as they approached the main gate. The guards wore different uniforms and spoke different languages, but gates remained gates and fences remained fences. The truck stopped before a low wooden building marked with a red cross symbol. The soldier who had driven them opened the tailgate and stepped back, allowing them space to descend on their own. Greta noticed how he kept his hands visible, how he announced each action before executing it. These were not the behaviors of men who seized what they wanted without asking. A tall sergeant emerged from the building, his uniform immaculate despite the late afternoon heat. His weathered face carried kindness, with crow's feet suggesting he smiled far more often than he frowned. He spoke to the driver in English, then approached them with deliberately measured steps. "My name is Sergeant Morrison," he said in heavily accented but comprehensible German. "You will be staying in Building 7. It is clean and secure. No one will enter without your permission." Liesel produced a small sound of disbelief, quickly stifled. Permission. The word felt foreign, almost meaningless. They had not been granted permission for anything in so long that Greta had forgotten what possessing meaningful choices felt like. Morrison led them across the compound, past rows of tents where American soldiers looked up from their evening occupations. Some stared with curious eyes, others with expressions Greta couldn't decipher. But none called out crude remarks or made the gestures she had come to expect. They simply watched and returned to their card games and letter writing. Building 7 was a converted barracks containing 6 cots, arranged along the walls, each topped with a folded blanket and a small wooden crate serving as a bedside table. The blankets were wool, thick and clean, possessing the kind of softness that spoke of proper washing and meticulous care. Greta ran her fingers along one edge and felt something release in her chest at the simple luxury of clean fabric. "There are rules," Morrison said, withdrawing a sheet of paper from his jacket. He tacked it to the wall beside the door, the German text written in careful block letters. Rule number 1, no prisoner will be sexually assaulted or harmed. Rule number 2, no soldier may enter this building without permission from the occupants. Rule number 3, meals will be delivered at 0800, 1200 and 1800 hours. You are not required to earn them. Ingrid stared at the posted rules with the intensity of someone attempting to decode an entirely foreign language. "This is," she began, then stopped, as though the words she needed didn't exist in any language she possessed. A young guard appeared carrying a metal pot and 3 bowls. He was barely older than Liesel, possessing the soft features of someone who had likely been working his family's farm just a year prior. He set the pot on the floor just inside the door and retreated immediately. "Soup," he said in broken German, his cheeks flushing pink with effort. "Hot soup for eating." When he reached toward Liesel to hand her a bowl directly, she flinched so violently she stumbled backward and fell onto one of the cots. The young guard froze, his face draining of color at having frightened her. Morrison appeared beside him instantly. "Johnson," he said quietly in English, then switched to German. "We announced ourselves. We keep distance. We let them come to us." The guard, Johnson, nodded rapidly and set the bowls on the floor beside the pot. "Sorry," he whispered in German. "Very sorry. No hurt, no hurt." After they left, the 3 women sat in silence, staring at the steaming pot. It smelled of vegetables and meat, rich and nourishing. More than that, it had been given freely, without demands or expectations. Greta reached for a bowl with trembling fingers, half expecting someone to appear and demand payment for this kindness. No one came. Outside their window, American soldiers called to each other in the gathering dusk, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of men who slept safely through the night. For the first time in 4 years, Greta allowed herself to wonder if she might also sleep safely. The routine began feeling like a small miracle by the 3rd day. Breakfast arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, delivered by young soldier Johnson, who had learned to knock twice, announce himself, and wait for permission before entering. He set the tray just inside the door with careful reverence, as though he understood he was handling something more fragile than dishes and food. Greta found herself waking before each knock, her body still conditioned for hypervigilance, yet no longer braced for immediate danger. She would lie on her cot, listening to Liesel's soft breathing and Ingrid's precisely controlled sleep, marveling at the absence of heavy boots in the hallway, the lack of crude voices demanding entrance. The silence felt almost too good to trust. The infection in her shoulder had been festering for weeks, a souvenir from a particularly brutal Nazi officer who enjoyed leaving marks as proof of his power. She had concealed it carefully, knowing visible wounds often made men either more violent or more disgusted. But on the 4th morning, when she couldn't lift her right arm without wincing, Liesel noticed the way she favored her left side. "You're hurt," Liesel said, her voice carrying particular gentleness she reserved for moments when she wasn't drowning in her own terror. "The shoulder, yes." Before Greta could deflect or downplay the injury, Ingrid was beside her with the efficient assessment of someone who had spent years caring for others. "That needs medical attention," she said with quiet authority. "It's infected." Requesting help from American soldiers felt impossible. Help had always arrived carrying hidden costs, and medical attention from men had never focused on healing. Yet as morning progressed and the throbbing in her shoulder intensified, Greta found herself contemplating the unthinkable. When Johnson arrived with lunch, Ingrid stepped forward with careful dignity that made her seem taller than her actual height. "Excuse me," she said in her precise German, then attempted the English phrase she had been practicing. "Medical help, please." Johnson's boyish face immediately creased with concern. He set down the food tray and hurried away, returning moments later with a compact Asian-American soldier who moved with quiet efficiency, characteristic of someone accustomed to emergencies. "I'm Corporal Chen," the medic said in German significantly better than Morrison's. "I understand someone needs medical attention." When Greta reluctantly indicated her shoulder, Chen nodded and opened his medical bag on the small table. Instead of immediately reaching for her, he began removing supplies and explaining each item as he arranged it. "Antiseptic solution for cleaning," he said, showing her a brown bottle. "Clean bandages, antibiotic powder. This might sting when I clean the wound, but it will help prevent further infection." He paused and looked directly at her eyes. "I need to examine the injury to treat it properly. Is that acceptable to you?" The question hung suspended like something unprecedented. "Acceptable to you?" As though her acceptance mattered, she had whispered her consent without conviction, the word feeling strange in her mouth. Then, forcing more strength into her voice, she said it again. "Yes." Chen's touch was methodical, unhurried, his movements those of a healer rather than a predator. His fingers were careful as he walked her through what he was doing at each moment. "The infection has spread somewhat, but it's contained to this area. I'll need to flush it completely and get antibiotics working on it right away. Keep it dry and covered for the next several days," he explained. As he cleaned the wound with steady, practiced strokes, Greta found herself really looking at him. His face held no desire, no calculation about future favors or debts owed. He was simply doing what he had been trained to do. Tending an injury with the same concentrated attention he would give any soldier brought to him wounded. "There," he said when he finished, smoothing down the fresh bandage with medical tape. "Change the dressing every single day. If you notice red lines spreading outward from the wound, or if you develop a fever, you need to get someone to fetch me immediately." He repacked his medical kit and rose to leave, though he paused before heading to the door. The body is actually quite remarkable at healing itself when it's given what it needs, proper care and safety. Both of those things are yours here. The three women sat afterward in absolute quiet. Eventually, Liesel broke the silence, and her voice carried something close to amazement. "He asked first." "He actually asked before he touched you, and then he told you exactly what he was doing." Ingrid's mind, trained for decades to organize and catalog information, seized on this detail, every step, every instrument, every reason why. That same evening, when Morrison stopped by to check on them as he did each night, Ingrid surprised herself by stepping forward. "The Red Cross," she began carefully. "Do they help people locate their relatives?" Morrison's weathered features grew soft at the edges. "They do, yes. Are you looking for someone?" "My sons," she said, and the word seemed to unlock something she had locked away tightly for years. "Two boys, twins, they're 11 years old now. When I was taken into custody, they were placed with American authorities." Her voice faltered and stopped. She couldn't finish the thought. "I'll bring you the forms tomorrow," Morrison told her gently. "The Red Cross has had tremendous success at bringing families back together." That night, the three women talked about something beyond mere survival for the first time. Liesel admitted she had once dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher, of standing before a classroom like Ingrid did. Greta spoke hesitantly about her mother's roses, the way they tangled up the cottage walls each summer in brilliant reds and pinks. Ingrid told them about her sons, how they laughed, how they rushed to embrace her when they came through the door after school. As they spoke, their voices grew fuller, louder, shedding the whispered tones that had become their default. Beyond their window, the American camp moved through its evening rhythms. The sounds of ordinary life, voices, footsteps, the clinking of dishes drifted through the spring darkness. And for the first time in years, the next day seemed like something to look forward to rather than merely survive through. The film reels came on a morning when spring had shifted into something colder, the air crisp rather than warm. Greta noticed the mood around camp shift before she understood why. Soldiers' conversations stopped short when they passed the building. The casual laughter that had become their constant companion grew thin and strained. When Morrison appeared after breakfast, his usual steadiness had vanished beneath something heavier, grimmer. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man Greta hadn't encountered before, compact, with eyes that seemed hard as stone and shoulders that appeared to carry some invisible burden. "This is Corporal Sullivan," Morrison said in his careful German. "He's joining us for the next several weeks." Sullivan's gaze moved across the three women with an intensity that made Greta's skin prickle. This wasn't the careful medical assessment Chen gave, nor the kind sympathy of young Johnson. This was evaluation, judgment, the look of someone trying to weigh guilt and innocence on invisible scales. "Ma'am," Sullivan said formally, nodding toward Ingrid as the oldest. But something cold threaded through his voice, and Liesel instinctively stepped closer to Greta. After they left, the comfortable quiet they had built shattered. The routines they had begun to trust seemed suddenly fragile now, as if one wrong glance could demolish everything. Over the following days, the shift became undeniable. Guards who had grown relaxed now maintained stiff distances. Johnson still brought their meals with courtesy, but his youthful smile looked forced, his eyes refusing to meet theirs directly. It was Corporal Chen who finally spoke about what was happening. He arrived to examine Greta's shoulder, his medical bag in hand, but his usual calm seemed stretched thin. "New information came in about the camps," he said quietly, working at her bandages. "Film documentation. The men are wrestling with what they've learned." Greta's breath caught. They had heard whispered rumors over the years, terrible stories that seemed too awful to be real. But rumors and documented truth were entirely different. Some of them are struggling with the idea that German women could be victims of the same system that did those things, Chen continued, his hands gentle as he applied fresh dressing. It's hard for them to accept that victims and perpetrators could both be German. That afternoon, Sullivan returned without Morrison's presence to moderate. He carried a file folder and wore the expression of someone carrying out an unwelcome responsibility. "I need to ask you questions," he said in German, thick with accent, his tone turning each question into an accusation waiting to be confirmed. Ingrid drew herself to full height, summoning the authority that had once filled classrooms. "What kind of questions?" Sullivan opened the folder. The photographs spilled out, black and white, grainy, but unmistakably terrible. Emaciated figures behind wire, mass graves, children with eyes like hollow sockets. "What did you know?" His voice had turned sharp with anger barely contained. "What did you see?" The images lay between them like evidence, like proof. Greta stared at the documented horror and felt something cave inward. Not surprise exactly, but a horrible confirmation that humanity could do these things. She had known evil up close, had lived with it pressed against her for 4 years. But seeing it documented, official, made her own survival feel tainted, complicit somehow. "We knew we were nothing," she whispered, her voice almost gone. "We understood we didn't matter at all." "That's not an answer," Sullivan snapped, and now his rage was completely visible. These camps existed everywhere, throughout Germany. Everyone had to know, everyone had to see something. Liesel began to tremble, her fragile calm crumbling beneath the weight of his accusation. "They told us we were fortunate," she said, tears streaming. "They said we could have ended up in labor camps instead. We thought they meant factories." Ingrid's instincts as an educator surfaced even as her composure threatened to crack. "We were told we served a greater good," she said with bitter precision. "We were told our suffering kept worse things from happening to the others. We believed we were paying the price to save people." Sullivan's expression twisted with such disgust it felt like a physical assault. "How do I know you're not just as guilty as the rest?" The question landed like a sentence. Greta felt 4 years of survival strategies crumble. The shame she had fought so hard to suppress came flooding back, mixed now with the knowledge that while they suffered, others died in ways that made their own torture look almost merciful by comparison. "Maybe we are," Greta finally said, her throat raw. "Maybe surviving at all makes us guilty. Maybe we should have died instead." Sullivan gathered the photographs and stood, abandoning them with their shame and the crushing certainty that their brief dignity had been an illusion. The 3 women huddled on the cots as darkness fell, no longer 3 healing bodies, but 3 people marked by survival as if it were their crime, as if staying alive had been a choice and a sin. The sounds from outside, the evening camp routines, now felt distant and condemning, as if even the spring air held judgment. The silence in the building became unbearable, a weight pressing down from all sides. For 3 days after Sullivan's interrogation, the women moved through their routines like apparitions, barely speaking. They took their meals with downcast eyes, waiting for the moment when someone would realize what they truly were and strip away even these small moments of mercy. Greta mentally catalogued each kindness she had received. The clean blankets, the gentle medical attention, the simple act of being asked permission, preparing to surrender them all as payment for the crime of living when others perished. Liesel retreated into the silent rocking that had once been her only refuge, her eyes fixed on the wall, seeing nothing. Ingrid sat rigid, her mind desperately searching for some framework that might make sense of guilt and innocence when both concepts had become meaningless. When Morrison appeared on the 4th morning, flanked by Sullivan and holding official documents, Greta's heart dropped. This was it, the reckoning, the moment when their sanctuary would be stripped away and Sullivan's photographs would be confirmed as truth. That surviving German women were inherently suspect, tainted by the mere fact of breathing. But Morrison didn't read charges or demand confessions. Instead, he stepped forward with the same careful kindness he had shown since they arrived. Sullivan stood behind him, his face churning with conflicting emotions. "What happened in those camps isn't your responsibility," Morrison said quietly, steady hands holding the document. "And what happened to you isn't your fault either." The words seemed to come from somewhere impossible, where reason and mercy could coexist. Greta felt them strike like physical blows, each one challenging the guilt she had wrapped around herself like protection. Morrison's gaze included Sullivan. "These women survived something terrible. They're not your enemy. They're what we were fighting to protect." Sullivan's face shifted, crumpled slightly as if something inside him had fractured. He looked at Greta with eyes that truly saw her for the first time, not as a symbol of German guilt, but as a girl whose childhood had been taken, whose innocence had been weaponized. "How old were you?" he asked in halting German, his voice stripped of accusation. "When they took you?" 19, Greta whispered, the number feeling both impossibly ancient and impossibly young. Sullivan's eyes closed for a moment. When they opened, something fundamental had changed inside him. "Jesus," he breathed in English, then struggled for German words. "My sister, she's 19 now. She's back in Ohio." He extended his hand toward Greta, not to take anything but to help her stand. The gesture was small and enormous. The first time in 4 years a man had reached toward her with the intention of lifting her up. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "My brother died fighting this. I thought anger would honor him somehow, but he'd be ashamed of me. He'd want me to help you, not hurt you more." Morrison opened the document. Not an accusation, but Red Cross paperwork and repatriation forms. "We found your sons," he told Ingrid gently. "They're safe with American authorities in Munich. They're healthy. They ask about their mother every day." Ingrid's control finally broke. She wept, not from pain or shame, but from the shock of a mother's love being answered instead of punished. Liesel reached for her with shaking hands, and for the first time in days, her face showed something other than terror. "You'll all be transferred to the repatriation center next week," Morrison continued, "but I need you to understand something before you go." He looked at each of them carefully, his expression carrying absolute conviction. "Tell people what you witnessed here. Tell them that some of us remembered you were human when the world decided you weren't." Greta felt something shift inside her, not breaking, but settling, pieces finding their correct places. She had been 19 when they stole her life. She was 23 now, and 23 was old enough to decide what came next. "Tell your families," she said, her voice growing stronger, "that 3 German women will spend the rest of their lives proving that kindness is more powerful than cruelty." Outside their window, the spring afternoon carried the sounds of men preparing for peace instead of war. For the first time since they had been freed, the future looked like something worth walking toward, not something to merely endure.